Hello, and welcome to The Third Space, the podcast for those who see the beauty of Catholicism as well as the ugliness, who have experienced real harm and real grace in the Church. I'm your host, Paul Fahey, a mental health counselor and catechist. In every episode, I will have conversations with guests about the good and the bad in the Church, avoiding easy answers or black and white fundamentalism, in order to hold on to all that is true. And today I'm talking with Dr. Julia Sadusky, and the topic is parents talking with their kids about sex. As a heads up, if you're listening with kids, as the title suggests, we will be having frank conversations about sex in this episode. Dr. Julia Sadusky is an author, speaker, and licensed psychologist. She owns Lux Counseling and Consulting in Littleton, Colorado, where she offers individual, family, and couples therapy, in addition to consultations for individuals and families about sexuality and gender. She also serves as a ministry educator, offering trainings and consultations to counseling centers and faith-based institutions on sexuality, gender identity, mental health, trauma-informed care, and the intersection of sexuality, gender, and theology. Other areas of focus include work with those experiencing complex trauma and eating disorders. Dr. Sadusky's most recent books are Start Talking to Your Kids About Sex, A Practical Guide for Catholics, and Talking with Your Teen About Sex, A Practical Guide for Catholics, both from Ave Maria Press. She has authored two other books, including Emerging Gender Identities, Understanding the Diverse Experiences of Today's Youth, and Gender Identity and Faith, Clinical Postures, Tools, and Case Studies for Client-Centered Care with Mark Yarhouse. And she contributed to a 4Views book titled Understanding Transgender Identities, 4 Views from Baker Academic. So Julia, I think we first connected about a year or so ago. I had some stuff come up in my area, and was having some challenges navigating being a Catholic counselor and some of the implications of that, and navigating that. And I'd reached out to a couple of people, and someone had recommended that I reach out to you. And I think at that point, I'd maybe heard you on a couple of podcasts several months before. Like, your name was familiar, but only vaguely. And I think I just sent you a message through your website, and then the next day you emailed me back, and within like 3 days we had a Zoom meeting. And I remember that standing out because there were other people locally who I was trying to reach out to, and you were way more responsive than the local people. And that conversation was really encouraging. I've followed your work ever since then. And I'm so grateful to be having this conversation with you here. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, Paul, I remember that well. And it was a gift to me at the time to get to chat with you. So I'm looking forward to today as well.
Excellent. So the conversation I wanted to have today, from your bio, you've written more than a couple books, but two books that I wanted to talk about, and they're kind of a series. The first one is Start Talking to Your Kids About Sex, A Practical Guide for Catholics, and then Talking with Your Teen About Sex, A Practical Guide for Catholics. This is a topic I've been interested in for a while. First of all, as a parent, my oldest child is in 7th grade. My youngest is a toddler. Something that's been on my mind as a parent for a long time. But also it's something I've been interested in as a former parish minister who led safe environment trainings, as a therapist now, then also as someone who works in the work that I do addressing spiritual abuse in the Church. There's a lot of overlap between these discussions. So I'm really interested in this conversation. Before we jump into some of the content of the book, though, I'm wondering about your own story and how you ended up working as a psychologist, specifically in areas of gender and sexuality.
Yeah, so I was raised Catholic, grew up on the East Coast, from a pretty big Catholic family. I'm one of 7 kids. And so I would say, as far as my own kind of history of psychology and faith, I was really interested in psychology as a young kid. In my teens, there were people close to me who were experiencing mental health challenges and were going to therapy, and I was not impressed actually by how the therapists were treating people I loved. And I remember at that age really wanting to be the person in the room who could show up differently for people. So I knew as a teenager that I had no idea what to say or do with people I loved, and they needed help I couldn't offer. But I really, at that time, wanted to become the person who could kind of show up for people in those spaces. And so that honestly captures a lot of what eventually became kind of the calling in my life, which was if there's a gap that I see, I want to kind of step into it and fill it. And that mirrors really nicely with what happened for me as far as sexuality and gender and faith, which is, quite simply, I was at Ave Maria for undergrad, and I was studying theology of the body, and I was really captivated by the teachings of Pope St. John Paul II. And at the exact same time, I was having people in my life who were sharing with me that they experienced attraction to people of the same sex, and they were asking me really hard questions about salvation, about attraction change, about what is the call of the Christian with these experiences. And as somebody who was raised Catholic and had pretty good formation throughout my life, especially in the realm of sexuality, I was so struck by the fact that I had almost nothing to offer. And so that really spurred in me a journey of trying to understand as much as I could about human sexuality from a psychological perspective and also from a faith perspective. And that led me to Regent to study under Mark Yarhouse, who's a specialist, a Protestant Christian who specializes in sexuality, gender, and faith. And I was doing youth ministry there, so this would have been 2014, 2015. And at that time, I was starting to get questions in youth group and youth talks that I was giving about sexual orientation. I was getting asked questions about gender. And I remember at the time saying, I know nothing about the gender space, except for I have this mentor who specializes in gender dysphoria. And before I knew it, my first practicum year, I was working, probably half of my caseload was people with questions around sexuality and gender. And I became aware very quickly that most clinicians don't have that experience. And so that really informed a lot of the speaking I started doing with Mark Yarhouse around these topics. And then, of course, that led to the book we wrote in 2019, Emerging Gender Identities. And so to be honest, it's the last place I would have expected to end up if you had asked me, even as an undergrad student. But I really feel like God just opened and expanded my heart for people I already loved and already cared about who had these questions. And I am naturally a curious person, and so I really appreciate places of complexity, and I've been, very invigorated and challenged by this work for many years now.
Yeah. I think your comfort in the complexity is something that has kept me really engaged in the work that you're doing, and something that I experience as somewhat unique. I think the name of the podcast is Third Space, right? And it comes from wanting to hold space for people who've experienced both truly good things and also truly harmful things within the Catholic Church. But it also kind of points to this broader, this broader point of Catholicism of it's the both and. It's the holding on to more even when things feel contradictory that is often more true. And that's something that I see in your work of, you are deeply orthodox, shaped by the teachings of the Church, but also you are deeply person-centered. And in your work, what I don't hear is someone doing apologetics. What I don't hear is someone with an ulterior agenda. What I don't hear is culture warring or ideology. What I hear is someone who's just trying to hold space for the complexities of people who have these values shaped by Christianity and these experiences, good and bad, with sexuality and gender. And how can we seek what's true? And how can we seek that with curiosity and without fear, without feeling threatened? That has been my experience of encountering your work, which is, and I'll share about that later, why I found these books in particular as good as they were, because there wasn't that fear, there wasn't that even unintentional hidden agenda behind it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. I I think in terms of reality-based living, I've been talking about that a good bit with clients and even just in my own personal life. What does it look like to live in a reality-based way? And I think many of us are afraid of what's the reality. But it's been my experience as a Catholic who works in psychology, a space that's not always friendly to our faith. And in some cases, there's been, I guess you said, a lot of hurt there that informs that. But it's been my experience that the more that I delve into spaces of complexity, the more the kind of simple truths of the gospel mean everything. And so I have my fears, and I've had my fears about these spaces of complexity. And I think being able to rest in the conviction that God knows all of this more deeply and more complexly than I could even hold. And yet the simplicity of the gospel is as much alive, and most alive perhaps in these places, has been a real gift to me and has settled me in my own fears as I move through this stuff.
I'm curious what drew you specifically to wanting to create resources for parents who want to talk, or for Catholic parents who want to talk with their kids about sex. You talked about how a lot of your journey through life has been seeing gaps and then filling gaps. What gap did you see in this space within Catholicism that, what gap did you see, and what do you feel like you were able to offer to fill that gap?
Yeah, so it's an interesting story. I mean, a lot of what I do comes from somebody asking me a question that's too hard to write about in a text response. So that was true for these books as well. I actually had close friends reaching out to me, parents of young children who would ask me questions about, exploratory play, a child touching their genitalia and doing so in front of maybe neighborhood friends, and what does the parent do? And so I had people asking me about that, and I was in the process of pitching an entirely different book topic to Ave Maria Press at the time, and the proposal was in and the sample chapter was written, and they had a delay in reviewing my proposal. And it was in that month that I think I got 3 questions very quickly from 3 different friends. And the thing I kept hearing from these people when I would script what you might say was, I wish there was something written out there that would script to us what to say. That's so helpful. And so I started looking up resources. I typed in on Google, exploratory play, tips for children. And Planned Parenthood's website was the first thing that came up. And when I clicked on the website and looked at the content, I thought, wow, the content is actually really accurate. It's really informed by psychology. It's something that any Catholic parent could apply. But no Catholic parent that I'm in conversation with is going to go to Planned Parenthood's website as a resource. And so I think at the time I thought, surely there's something else. So I kind of kept digging, and I really didn't find anything comprehensive in the realm of sexual formation for young kids. And at the exact same time, I was meeting with families of clients who were teenagers who had been exposed to pornography or unwanted sexual experiences or boundary violations of various types. And I thought, what would it look like to give people something that's actually proactive in this space and isn't just responding after the fact, but is actually making the types of experiences that harm kids less likely? There's no bulletproof solution here, but there are ways that we can be proactive that actually keep kids more safe and actually make kids more likely to come to us when something goes wrong. So that was the premise of that first book, is the early sex ed that needs to be happening long before a sex talk that actually helps prevent unwanted sexual experience and sexual trauma. That was the idea for that first book. And when I pitched that to Ave Maria Press, they were very excited, and they came back and said, why don't you write a book for parents of teens as well, which is really my specialties, in the adolescent years. So that made a lot more sense to me. And I thought, oh, sure, I'll do both. And then, of course, my next year was spent writing books. So yeah, loved those projects, really happy with how they turned out, and also really grateful to hear the feedback from parents that it's actually meeting a need, that there was nothing out there that was scripting in those kinds of specific ways.
Yeah, it was funny. I was, with family over the holidays, and I was reading these books in preparation for this conversation, and one of my family members was like, "Oh, we have that book. That book was so helpful." And then she just went on like, "Oh yeah, that book was so helpful."
Good.
I'm curious why you think that these resources weren't available, because these seem like, an overlap I found in the first book, the one for younger children, was some of my experience in safeguarding, and a good friend and a ministry partner, Monica Pope, years ago, she had written a safe environment program for Catholic school and religious ed kids for our diocese, and was adopted by our diocese for a while. And it was a presentation that would be given to both children and parents there. And it was like there were really similar things. And also, we chose this program written by Monica. I was a part of a committee that reviewed several different programs, and none of them were great. Like, this was by far the best one, and really one of the few that stood out in my memory. It was a while ago. It was really about equipping kids to have that feeling of autonomy and empowerment to say no, to set boundaries, and to seek help. So yeah, I've seen that gap too, and I'm curious if you know why that gap is there. I feel like this seems like something that should be there.
Yeah, I get the sense that a lot of it has to do with the siloing of different fields of study. I think in the church, I don't know that different areas or spheres of the church are fully aware of how much modern psychology has to offer around prevention when it comes to harm, and how we respond in the aftermath of harm immediately, right, in ways that can really buffer the long-term implications of trauma and traumatic experiences. So there's just been a lot of development in psychology in the last, I think, probably 2 decades that has been remarkably helpful in getting us in a different position, one that's not so reactive in the face of harm. And again, I don't know that we all talk to each other enough to really allow that to be received. But I do think, I'm a millennial, and I was raised very much in the kind of on the aftermath maybe of some of the strongest purity culture messaging, and in the midst of a sex education in the church that was very chastity based. So let's talk about the virtue of chastity. And I think all of that kind of chastity formation, I think there is a place for that. I benefited from aspects of that as well. And there were pieces of it that were gaps for me in my own formation and that of people I know. And so I do think that our kind of focus in the church on, we're going to talk with kids and teens about chastity, and we're going to talk about refraining from sexual activity, and we're going to see that as a real protective factor against harm, really missed the fact that people need skills in order to be able to exercise self-mastery. That grace builds upon nature, and part of our human nature is actually needing to be taught some real skills that come clearly from psychology and human formation. And nobody in the sphere of psychology was stepping into that space. It was really theologians and philosophers, which again, there's such an important place for. It just was missing the human development component, and sex education and sexual conversations were only happening at or after puberty. And there's a ton of sexual development that's happening as early as in the womb. So yeah. That was a big gap, I think, and reason why we missed it along the way.
Yeah. There's so many directions we could go with this conversation. Your books cover so much. There's catechesis, there's theology, there's biology, there's psychology, and there's just the really practical tools and scripts for parents. But the angle that I think I want to focus this conversation in is how we as parents, and as Catholics even more widely, how we talk about sex or not talk about sex with children. How does that impact? I'd say like the negative impacts are what stand out to me. How does that impact kids as they grow up? How does that impact their relationships with themselves, their relationships with others, but also their relationship with the church and their relationship with God Himself? How these things are connected, and how going wrong, for lack of a better term, in talking about sexuality with children can lead to some of these real consequences down the road. So even before I ask specific questions, I'm wondering how you hear that as a general direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's so true. There's something in my work with Mark Yarhouse where we talk about prescriptive constraints and proscriptive constraints. So prescriptive, think prescription. That's the way we talk about something, gives people license to talk about it in certain ways and not in other ways. So, for instance, if all I say to a teenager is, sex is for marriage and you don't have sex outside of marriage, and in the event that somebody was to get pregnant outside of marriage, here's what they do, and that's not actually helping that young person interpret the world beyond those categories. So it says, this is how my parents know to talk about this, right? So then if a friend is sexually active and this teenager is weighing, what's the value of that? What are the challenges in that? That may be a topic that teen is not going to bring to mom and dad, because how we talk about it is saying this kind of thing doesn't exist or shouldn't exist. And there's no direction of what do I do when I encounter that? Where do I go then? So that's a prescription. We talk about sex in this way and we don't talk about it in other ways. And that's a constraint on communication. And then another proscriptive constraint is we don't talk about such things here. So good example of that would be teenagers who find themselves with same-sex attractions. And they would say, oh, I never heard anything about that. They said nothing about that. Or if they said something, it was a kind of flippant comment about a character on television, like, we're not going to have that in my house, and turn it off, right? So that's a proscription that says, this is not a topic on the table here. And so you asked this question, or kind of pontificated a little bit of like, how does that impact, right? My sense of self, my relationships with my parents, my relationship with God and the church. Well, it seems rather obvious, right? At some point that if there's only one way to talk about this, then I'm not going to talk about it except for in that way with God. So this is where we see a lot of people talking to God in prayer in kind of very scripted, filtered ways. Where, okay, God, I'm going to talk about, if I'm same-sex attracted, I'm going to pray that I can get married to a woman one day, and that's the only prayer I know, because this is how we talk about this. I'm not going to ask God, hey, can you help me? I have a crush on somebody and I don't know what to do about it, which might be a very fruitful prayer, right? So that would be one example. Or the proscription is God doesn't care about whatever this thing is. God doesn't see this thing. And I think for many young people in that place, they say the church doesn't have anything to say of value here. And that's where they leave. And then a last thing I'll say, just kind of to frame this, is when there is harm that has happened, and that world really kind of closely, sexual boundary violations, spiritual harm that happens around topics of sexuality. People no longer have the safety and the security to bring that sacred and very vulnerable and very tender place before God and before their community. It feels like I have to figure out how to kind of work through all of the sexuality pieces, and we all have, our own questions about that. I'm going to figure that out outside of the church, and then depending on where I land, I may reapproach the church. And I think that really splinters an area of life that is really meant to be integrated in our prayer and in our faith journey in our communities.
Yeah. Well, one there's one thing that comes to mind, and I'll try and like explain and ask the question, like the pieces are still coming together, but like some of the harms of not adequately communicating about sex to our kids, like some of those harms can be obvious, like some of the things you just shared. I mean, also things like inappropriate sexual behavior, sexual abuse towards them, looking at, the harm by like teenage pregnancies, things like that. Okay. But there's something too that I've seen in my clinical work, and I'll speak in like generalizations and like compilations of different stories from clients, but like I've seen this enough times that it feels like a thing that happens where you have an individual often in a more conservative or isolated environment growing up. So say like a purity culture space growing up, and the person engages in like exploratory play, or even older into puberty, sexual exploration with, say, like a family member that isn't inappropriate, but that's also very confusing for a child or adolescent who doesn't have any type of framework, even some basic biological understanding of what's going on. But then down the road, at a talk at church, or if a Catholic, like a Steubenville Youth Conference, they hear about how porn is bad, masturbation's bad, sex outside of marriage is a mortal sin, and all of a sudden they have this like moral framework, and they look back on this thing that happened 5 years before, and they're like, I must be bad. Mm-hmm. Like, they didn't have a moral framework when this stuff happened. Now they have a moral framework. It's like a version 1 moral framework. And then, but by the time like I'm talking with them decades after the fact, even though their moral framework has, grown up with them and become much more nuanced, in this part of their life, there's still like that version 1 moral framework of this belief of like, I am bad, and my sexuality is a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And that impacts the relationship with themselves. That impacts if they're in a romantic relationship or a marriage. Mm-hmm. And that also very much impacts the relationship with God, because something you just got at of like, this doesn't feel like something I can actually bring to God. Because I feel like a monster.
Correct.
So I don't see that talked about as much. That seems much, much more subtle. But yeah, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, but that's the other piece of writing these books, right? Is I was so privy to exactly what you're describing. This kind of framework of shame that is implanted in the young person on a random Tuesday, or at kind of a random Saturday at a youth conference, or in a youth group conversation, and a passing statement around categories of mortal sin. And it's the shame piece, which we believe as Catholics, right? After the fall, we have this kind of shame set in that in some sense is positive, in the sense that it reminds us these areas of our life can be subject to harm. And so there's a kind of reverence and a desire to cover. But there's also, after the fall, a sense of badness, a fundamental lost sense of my goodness as a sexual being. And so that converges with our experiences in ways that cause a ton of harm for people, exactly in the ways you described, where it's shame, yes. It's also a profound fear response, right? So when you say, I'm a monster, or you say, I'm bad, it's also, I'm dangerous. My sexual capacities are a source of danger and harm to myself and others, and I could not know it's harmful and do it anyway. So that gets at a fundamental sense of trust in myself, and frankly also rage at God. I've seen that as well, where people are, why would you give me this thing and not equip me with the ability to kind of not stumble into mortal sin, is kind of how it feels based on that version 1 kind of belief. And so I see that a lot in people. And again, so much of that early sexual formation is meant to actually equip people in developmentally appropriate ways to be able to have an interpretive lens of their body, of their genitalia, to reduce shame when they're 6 and when they're 8 and when they're 10, before the surging of hormones, so that they have enough of a framework for all of this where it feels like chartered territory and they know what's happening and they have more of a capacity to engage their will over time. And so much of what we're doing is kind of helping bring compassion and understanding into those spaces that people didn't have what they needed to be able to navigate that at the time or at the youth conference or in the youth group in a very effective way.
Yeah, and it's not just, and that's something that I found valuable in your books. It's not just a biological framework or a value or moral framework, but there's also like practical boundaries, right? Because then it's like you're having these conversations with a child who's 6 or 8 or 10. You've also set up boundaries of like what's not appropriate with other people also.
Yes.
Like it's a multifaceted foundation that's really important.
Right. We're not throwing out high expectations. We're not throwing out boundaries. We're not throwing out the kind of guardrails that kids benefit from. We're incorporating those guardrails in a way that they can actually respond to and use. And then we're also creating an expectation that there will be times that they cross beyond the guardrail, or that somebody else crosses beyond the guardrail. And we don't need to always be very descriptive about what that is, but we want to help a kid know that their body is going to actually signal when that happens, and trust in their body, and helping them know what to do when their body's screaming at them or subtly waving at them, hey, this is a little bit mixed, that they can know what to do with that information, which is a huge gap in sexual formation right now.
Yeah. Oh, man. In the work I've done, especially in the area of spiritual abuse, but specifically like abuse of conscience, there's a real element of people who have experienced their conscience being abused.
Yeah.
There's this profound distrust of themselves. So like being able to empower children to be able to trust both these both like their bodies and their nervous systems, but also this moral voice, this voice of God in their conscience too. Okay, I feel like I'm going down cul-de-sacs. One question I wanted to get to was, why is this so hard for parents? I took a class in grad school. There was an elective for sex counseling, and it was a secular counseling program. I knew as someone with Catholic values, like what was going to be in the class, but I loved the professor, and I saw this as a real opportunity to just be stretched and to grow. And it was a really great class. But early on in the course, the professor asked a question, and we were a relatively small cohort, but I mean some diversity. There was early 20s Gen Z. I was probably the oldest, mid-30s millennial. Some Catholic, some Christian, some non-religious, some homeschooled, some public schooled, some private Christian or Catholic school. And the professor asked who felt like they had an adequate sex education growing up, either from parents, school, or both. And no one raised their hand. And that became kind of an ongoing topic of we didn't get anything. And there was sharing stories of, students would share about, I'm forgetting her name, but a woman who would apparently go around Michigan and give talks at high schools about STDs and just scare the living hell out of kids. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, wait, I went to one of those, right? And it was actually that was not good. That was kind of traumatic. One of the assignments in that class was, it was kind of like a chart. And in one column, it was all these different aspects of sexuality, from things like puberty, menstruation, intercourse, pornography. I don't know, there were probably 12 or 15 things. And then different columns after each one, it was, how and when did you learn about this?
Mm.
And then the last question was, looking back, how do you wish you would have learned about this?
Wow.
As a prompt for reflection that I found surprisingly challenging and insightful for myself. Specifically as, that was a few years ago, as kids who were just starting middle school, of how do I want this to shape the conversations I have with them, mm-hmm. And identifying some of the own barriers I had. So to kind of throw that out there, in all the work that you've done, what do you think are the largest barriers for parents? Do you see them as generational? I think there's a part of me that kind of wants to see maybe this generation of parents is better. I don't know if that's the case, but I'm curious, what are the largest barriers that you see?
Yeah, I think, there's a couple of pieces to that. Certainly the biggest one that I see is a lack of modeling. To your point, across the political spectrum, across religiosity, across type of schooling growing up, across religious tradition, across political, kind of approaches to life, nobody had the models to be effective in sexual education. That's a consistent theme. And so if we don't have models for tasks before us as parents, this is true for anybody, we're going to do it poorly. I mean, I often use the analogy of driving. If I'm told to go drive a car and I never see somebody do it before, I'm tasked with that, it's going to take me a heck of a lot longer to do that. And I might be quite paralyzed sitting in the vehicle looking at it like I'm in an alien spaceship, right? And that's a little bit of a snapshot into what I think is happening internally for most parents, is there is such a profound unknown here. And we as humans like to feel effective. So we're going to focus on what we know, and we're going to avoid what we don't know, unless it rises to a threshold of urgency. And so then when it becomes urgent, when I walk in the room and my teenager has pornography on their phone and I see it, well, now it's urgent. But I actually see many parents still initially respond and then never talk about it again. So there's still that avoidance. And I think, again, lack of role models is one of the biggest things, which was why I wrote the books, was I thought, let's script this. Let's imagine we're putting together a bit of a manual for best case scenario that you can tweak and do in 200 ways beyond what I'm saying, but it gives you one framework, one way of doing it. I think that's a big piece. I do think our own sexual shame has a lot to do with it. Again, both after the fall of humanity, but also through our own experiences of sexual harm. Many parents experienced sexual boundary violations, sexual abuse in childhood, and have not contended with it. And so when they see things that touch on the realm of sexuality more broadly, I think it is very activating of shame. And shame takes on exactly the forms that it takes on in our trauma responses, right? A kind of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, none of which ends up feeling very effective in parenting. So I think that's another piece. And honestly, the last piece is just resourcing. I think it's a privilege to have time to reflect. It's actually not something that's afforded all of us in particular seasons of life, and in general for some people, to sit and reflect, to read a book, to journal, to see a therapist. There's a ton of access points that are not available to a lot of people because of the kind of nature of daily life for parents, which is exceedingly entrenched in the urgent demand of the moment. And so I think for parents, it's just so challenging to be proactive because it requires setting aside that time in the short term that's going to have long-term gains. And if you didn't see your parents do it and find value in it, I think there is a voice inside that says, like, we'll be able to get by without this until we won't. And so let's just put it off as long as possible.
Yeah. I like that point about having the time being a privilege. I appreciated that in the introduction of your books, where you're like, as someone who has 5 kids, you were like, So if you're looking for resources on these specific things, here's the specific chapters to go to. You don't need to read the whole thing. It reminded me of a sleep book for infants and toddlers that my wife and I read when our oldest was a baby. And we hadn't gotten more than 3 hours of sleep in months, right? And the book was like, just go to this chapter for this. I'm like, thank goodness, because
Yes.
I got about 15 minutes before I fall asleep reading.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Because we live in a time with so much information. I mean, how many people say, "Oh, I'll add it to my dusty list of books that I need to read," and so there really is a sense of we have more information than ever and less time than ever before to really be in a place where we could receive complex information and wonder about how we might apply it with our particular child. And so I'm really interested in, again, bridging those gaps. How do we make this as accessible as possible, be as compassionate as possible to parents, and help you know that you're not a bad parent if you're hearing us talk about this and thinking, I haven't thought of any of this. Of course you haven't thought of any of this. Who has time to think about this? Well, I happen to not be a parent, so I have a little bit of time to sit and reflect on all of these things and trying to kind of operationalize that in a language people can understand.
Yeah. One other question that I wanted to bring up that maybe kind of leads to a series of questions, and that is, like, all of those things you just mentioned make it hard for parents, make these types of conversations difficult. Our own experiences of shame, our own lack of modeling, our own lack of tools and resources and time to get tools and resources. Okay. But I think it becomes even more challenging in some ways when the parent is also Catholic and has Catholic values, and those values aren't aligned with a lot of the culture's values around sexuality. And I see lots of ways that that's challenging. There's a couple that come to mind off the top of my head. One is trying to pass along values, knowing that they aren't in line with the culture's values in a way that's compelling. And like not just compelling, but also like truthful. I remember listening to, I think it was Brett Sockold. He's a theologian up in Canada, and he has a podcast, and he was talking about, talking with kids about homosexuality, and like one point he made is he's like, if we tell our kids as they're growing up that gay people are bad, whether in words or in actions, if that's what we communicate, and they end up, as a lot of people do, end up having friends as young adults who are gay, and they're like, actually, this person in a lot of ways is more virtuous and more holy than I am, then they start to question, well, if that was BS, what else is BS, right? So, like, how do we present these values in a way that's compelling? But then also, is how do we present these values in a way that avoids perpetuating shame and passing our own shame and our own experience of, specifically religious shame around sexuality that we probably received. Again, speaking as a millennial and being on that part of purity culture. So how do we present these values in a way that's compelling, and how do we present them in a way that doesn't shame our kids in the way that we experienced? I don't know. There's a lot there. I'll throw that out.
Yeah. My mind's going immediately to having to be a salesperson for something you don't care about. I don't know if anybody's ever had the experience of being kind of a brand ambassador, but I did that in college a little bit.
Worst.
I would go to events and sell, Red Bull, which I don't drink and feel like tastes like cough syrup. And so there's a little bit of that here, is how do I offer something in a compelling way? Well, if I do it with integrity, I have to be compelled by it. And what's one of the things that make it hard to be compelled by it? Well, number one is lack of formation. I haven't been formed in it in a very robust way. Another thing is I have shame about the ways I fall short of the vision. And so maybe I want to avoid it for that reason. And so there's so much trepidation, there's so much shame about my own story and how it maybe departs from God's best for our sexuality that I can't even fake it. I can tell you the rules, but I can't tell you it in a compelling way because it feels like such a source of burden for me, or isolation or alienation or badness. And so we start, I think, with being compelled by it. What are the life-giving aspects? What was afforded to me? If in my case, I didn't have a child at 12, 13, 14, 15, I wasn't sexually active at that time. What was helpful about that for me? What did it open me up to? Well, I can look back and say, well, it opened me up to friendships. And I learned a lot through that. Well, what is the gifts of friendship? And what does that afford you as a Christian and as a human being in the world? What does that prepare you for in the world? And so I think that's part of why in my books I try to help parents reflect and help them be formed a little bit more. What is the thing that we're holding out here? What is beautiful and compelling about it? What has blessed you about it? Especially for young people today, they care about experience. They're not interested in rules for rules' sake. They're interested in story. And so for parents to be able to kind of step into their own story and embrace your story with the challenges and the ways I've fallen short and departed, and understanding God is totally with me and was with me in those places. He knows them. I can be excited about sharing a vision that I fall short of in some ways, because it is a beautiful, true, and good vision for the human person. That's kind of, I think, more of the starting point, but we have to be compelled by it or it doesn't work. Teens can tell. They are sniffing out inauthenticity. And so I do think that's important. I think the other piece is, how do we do so without shame? This annoys people, but I'm like, no, you're going to do it with shame. You're going to have shame. You're going to contend with your own shame. If you aren't contending with your own shame, you're probably not approaching the thing. Because sexuality is a space laden with shame. Again, both after the fall and after living in a human existence, that is not how it was meant to be. We carry shame in our bodies. So my job is not to eradicate shame and to live in a shame-free existence, and then my kids will be able to access this. It's when I bump up against my own shame, what do I do next? When I don't have the answer, what do I do next? When my child asks me a question that touches on my own story and I feel myself shutting down, what do I do next? That's interesting to me. That's a place of creativity. And creativity in places of shame is what starts to unleash the burden and weight of shame, right? Even neurologically, if I can access creativity in places of shame, I start to reawaken something that can move me out of a place of paralysis and trauma response. So it's not about avoiding shame. It's not possible to eradicate shame. It's how do I work with the parts of me that feel shame in a way that doesn't just dump that shame on my child. And when I dump, what do I do next? Do I take responsibility? Do I apologize? Do I say, hey, I noticed you in the bathtub touching your sister's vulva area, and I swatted your hand away. And the reason I did that is because I'm still learning how to respond calmly in moments that bring up things for me. So as your mom or as your dad, my job is to work on these things, and I want to apologize for swatting your hand. Because what did that teach you? And the kid may not say anything, right? They may not know. And so the parent's job is to say, if I were you, I would have felt some shame, like I was bad. And I want you to know you're not bad for being curious about your sister's vulva. Her vulva is different than your penis, and that probably looked really cool and interesting to you. And that makes sense. It's also important to know that your sister's genitalia, your sister's body parts are not a toy for you. And so we're not going to touch them as if they are a toy to be played with. And that's, something I want you to know as well. That's the key. What do I do after the shame comes up, not how to avoid it?
Yeah, and something that comes up in what you're saying is I think of ongoing, but some really intentional reflection for myself and my own story and my own values and my own experiences that came up, specifically around the class that I mentioned and the reflections that initiated. And those things are still ongoing, but how, I don't know, like, there's no wasted work. I feel like the personal work I've done in this area has helped equip me more to have these conversations with my kids, which I don't do perfectly, but that I'm trying. And that as I try to have those conversations, it's also helping me better understand my own story, that there's like a reciprocity there in helping address my own shame. I get to help my kids address or avoid theirs. Yes. And in helping them address theirs, I'm also like bringing healing to myself also.
Yes. And it's so it's the beauty of the vision for human sexuality that comes directly from our faith, right? That in kind of being sexual beings in the world, we actually communicate something to ourselves, to other people, and to the world about who God is, that God is Trinity, God is mutual gift, reciprocal gift. And I love what you're saying there, because it's actually that's the fulfillment of that kind of reflection of this, to be a fully alive sexual being is to live in the world and move in the world as gift. Gift is both given and received, right? It's the mutuality of that, and that's what you're describing, that there's a symbiotic relationship there. That it's not, I'm letting my kids work this out for me. It's not that. And it's not, I'm doing all the work to perfectly ensure my kid doesn't have work to do in this area. It's as I do my work and do that in relationship with my child, they get to step into work. And it's hopefully some different work than the work I have to do. And I'm being what I needed as a kid. And when I do that, there is healing that's happening in me that enriches me and allows me to move more confidently through this. And that's that's the hope, I think, for parents, is none of this is wasted, but it is work. To be clear, it is work. And I think it's important work. And arguably, as Catholics, maybe a most important work for us to learn what it is to be a gift in and through our sexuality.
Yeah. Along those lines, something I thought you did very well in your book that stood out to me in comparison to some of the other resources that I've seen for Catholic parents in this area is you were very intentional about the language that you used. That was really clear. Not just around catechesis in morality, but also in catechesis in morality. In what I interpreted, at least, as a very intentional effort on your part to not increase shame or burden readers with more shame. And that stood out, like I said, compared to other Catholic resources, because, I mean, for example, I've read the Catholic resources, and not just by theologians, but by people who are psychologists and who, in my opinion, ought to know better, who still go out of their way in their book to emphasize, when talking about, like, not even adolescents, but children, that, masturbation's a mortal sin, and it's really important that you know that. Which, if you can't tell, really infuriates me on a whole number of different levels. So yeah, I guess my question is, I assumed that was intentional, and I'm just curious how you react to that, and how you see your approach is different.
Yeah. Well, shame absolutely disrupts self-mastery. Shame moves you in a different direction than chastity and integrated sexual expression. So anything that is inducing shame is shooting a person in the foot in the realm of sexual health and sexual formation and spiritually whole sexual health. So it is intentional, because if we want people to be able to, as the Catechism talks about, kind of venture into the lifelong exacting work of chastity, to do so has to be rooted in reducing shame. Well, how have I seen shame steep in people without anybody even knowing? That framework of mortal sin being delivered to a child. I mean, I was of the generation of memorizing the Baltimore Catechism, and so I have very clear scripts in my mind around mortal sin. What I wasn't memorizing and didn't have in mind was the Catechism paragraph around masturbation, where it talks about how, force of habit can kind of reduce the culpability and the access to the will. Well, nobody was helping me memorize that, and that might have been helpful, right, for many people in sexual formation. And so we actually have to look at the broader landscape of what our church has given us when it comes to the sexual realm in particular, which is a real understanding of the psychological domain and a real tempering of this is a mortal sin. I mean, the Catechism paragraph on masturbation doesn't say this is a mortal sin. That's not what it says. It talks about something being disordered. It talks about something being, a cause for kind of concern and attention and attunement. And it talks about reduced culpability because of psychological factors. Well, what are those psychological factors? One very clear one would be age and moral development. And so with children and teenagers, I draw a lot from Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, and I'm by no means an expert in that area. But what I appreciate about that framework is it's helping us understand what a child is capable of understanding in the moral, ethical, and spiritual domain. And categories of black, white, good, bad, mortal sin, and hell attached, right, are not going to be frameworks, number one, that reduce harmful behavior. And they're not going to be frameworks that a child can digest in a language that they can understand and use. And so what I'm thinking is, what's the language that a child can understand and use that captures seriousness of things? These areas of our life matter. They are areas that ought to be treated with kind of the gravity, the gravitas that is there. And how do I do that in a way that is calm so that my child can have the levity to move through some of these developmental phases in a way that's life-giving?
Yeah.
That's hard to figure out.
And it's not only not productive, it is harmful. And it's harmful in a lot of different ways. So, like, one way that comes up a lot in discussions I have, again, about, like, abuse of conscience and mortal sin and all of this, is it can distort in a really fundamental way our understanding of who God is. So an example I use in discussions, like in my workshops and stuff, is like I taught middle school catechesis for a long time when I worked at the parish, and a couple times a year the students would have the opportunity to go to confession. So in the classes leading up to that, we'd do examination of conscience and reminders about all of this and stuff. And probably half the kids or so in the class, their families weren't actively practicing. So as we're preparing for confession, I mean, almost every time there would be a student who would ask, hey, I haven't been to Mass. Is that a mortal sin? Do I have to confess that? And they're like 12. So, I'd ask them some questions. I'd be like, so, is your family going to Mass and you're, lying about being sick so you can get out of it? Or what's going on? And they're like, oh, no, my family doesn't go to Mass. Okay. So you're like 12. Do you happen to live like across the road where you're able to walk to church yourself? No. We live way out in the country. Okay. Do your grandparents go to Mass and have they offered to drive you? No. Like none of my family practices. Okay. So are you choosing to not go to Mass, or are you just not able to? And they're like, well, I'm just not able to. And we unpack the discussion from there. Because what happens, what I've seen, what moves forward is if someone believes that God is going to threaten them with hell damn them to hell for not doing something that they're not able to not do, something outside of their control. What is the character of that God in this person's mind? So now, just move this from a discussion on going to Mass on Sunday to a discussion around pornography or masturbation, where we miss the nuance in the catechism that you very rarely pointed out of like affective immaturity, force of acquired habit, conditions of anxiety. I mean, as a therapist, I would very much add trauma and coping with trauma and coping with lack of attachment, et cetera, to this. This is behavior that is outside of a person's control, or can be outside of a person's control, especially if they're an adolescent.
That's right.
And if they're told this is a mortal sin, like it distorts who God is. And then I've seen at times, sorry, I'm kind of on a soapbox.
That's right.
I've seen at times how confession then makes it worse instead of making it better. Because it's like, oh, confession, like that's my only way to get in God's good graces. And it becomes this cycle of, and the language that's used even by teenagers sounds like substance use or something, of like, I use and then I feel shame, so then I go to confession and I feel better, but then I use again. And it's like, but we're talking about something that isn't actually in your control. And it just so quickly twists the vision of God. It twists the vision of grace. It twists the vision of the sacraments. Communion becomes this transactional thing. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Because somebody said to me recently, you know, the thing that God, it was actually Rachel Kilaki. She was giving a talk this year at the C conference, and she runs a ministry, Magdala Ministries, excellent ministry for women navigating dependency on pornography or masturbation. And one thing she said is, what was so instrumental for her own journey of healing and wholeness in her own sexual kind of journey has been recognizing the thing God cared about most with her was intimacy with her. The thing she cared about most and believed God cared about most by a lot of the narratives she was absorbing was he cares about right behavior, behavioral compliance. He wants me to be a good girl. And the more fundamental thing is God wants to be in relationship, honest, authentic, raw, messy relationship with her. It wants to be and is in the trenches with her, no matter what. And so what you're describing, that's the grief and the source of rage and anger at the injustice of some of the incomplete messaging that is not a full Catholic vision, to be clear. The full Catholic vision is what you're quoting from the Catechism. It's not one statement. It's a lot of different pieces that need to be unpacked and kind of fleshed out. But when we reduce that vision, what we also reduce is a person's capacity to approach the real God. And then you don't have the behavior, and you also don't have intimacy with the God of all the universe who loves you and has chosen you as his own, as you are. And so both then are robbed of you before you even have the capacity to know you've been robbed. Yeah. So you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what you're missing. And many people leave in those spaces. But I think the great tragedy is that people are missing out on the main thing, which is intimacy with the God of all the universe who died for them. And so these categories, again, I'm not here to say that there aren't categories that are helpful theologically to capture gravity, relative gravity of human behavior, and categories of sin are relevant and worth understanding in developmentally appropriate ways. And I think the way they've been applied to children and teenagers is failing to account for human development in a really fundamental way that has enormous consequences of harm.
Yeah, I think sometimes in our discussions we talk about moral actions abstracted from like moral actors in like concrete reality. Like Pope Francis, has a line he'd repeat a lot, that realities are more important than ideas. We actually have to put ideas and realities in in dialogue with each other, rather than impose abstracted realities. Impose abstracted ideas onto realities that are much more messy and much more complex.
That's right. Yeah, if I can add even just one more small illustration of what you're describing there that I think people will kind of grab a hold to, it's this idea of what we know about exploratory touch in early adolescence. So the majority of kids stumble upon pornography accidentally. First exposure is often traumatic and it's accidental. Number two, self-stimulation often happens accidentally. So kids don't know what they're doing and they find themselves stimulated by something that 2 months ago was not stimulating because they did not have all the raging hormones at that time and the body was not responding in a sexual way. And so kids don't know what's happening, engage in behaviors that lead to experiences of release and relief on a kind of physiological level. And they go back to the thing that feels good. And then 3 years later, they find out that masturbation is in the realm of mortal sin, right? And they damn themselves for all the other things. And again, then they tell me the scenarios and they're adults recalling back and they're saying, well, I was climbing up a tree and I experienced stimulation. And that felt good to me and I had no idea what that was. I didn't know. They said, well, talk to me about the 3 criteria for mortal sin for a second. Like, what are they again? And then we can bring in the wisdom that you have to know something's wrong. It has to be a grave matter. You have to have freedom of choice to do it anyway, right? These are the things that are getting lost, I think, in a lot of the popular conversation about pornography, masturbation, a whole host of other things that get applied with a kind of wide brush to young people in a way that does real harm.
Yeah. I'm looking at the time. So to start moving towards wrapping up, one question that I wanted to ask, knowing that the audience for this podcast includes people who have experienced various degrees of abuse and betrayal in the church, from the church. One question that comes to mind is, added on to all of the challenges that we've talked about for parents, I think one additional challenge is, how do I pass along Catholic values about sexuality that at least part of me sees as good and valuable, but that part of me doesn't fully trust, because I don't trust the church in this area because of the moral profound lack of credibility due to the sex abuse scandal, or from my own personal past experiences of being shamed in the church, or purity culture, or other things that we talked about. How would you encourage parents who are in this place where a part of them sees these Catholic values as good and a part of them really questions it and isn't sure? How would you encourage parents in this boat?
Yeah, and the parents that I speak to who are in that boat feel so alienated and feel as if making that statement, asking that question itself, means they're already out of the church. They're kind of out of communion by virtue of asking that question. And I see that as a very courageous, honest, integrated question. It's the question I imagine many people who become saints have uttered in prayer to God over and over and over again. We are not the first to live in egregious corruption in our churches. And so to first and foremost see that statement, that question, that crying out in prayer as an act of faith, not a defiance of faith, is a really critical, I think, first step, that you are in good company with Catholics of goodwill across the world who, if they're honest, have challenges in passing this on. And that is an enormous challenge. The second piece would be to take that to prayer. even more readily than you would take it to your friends, because friends don't always do a good job at normalizing these types of questions. And so, yeah, in prayer, I think that too is an act of trust that God sees all of the corruption from the inside. That scripture, "Woe to you, shepherds," is always really something I hold in mind, that to the extent that we're robbed by our circumstances of the capacity to feel full confidence in some of these things, is an injustice that we can and ought to grieve. And then finally, as maybe one more encouragement, I talk a lot with parents about being what you needed to your kids. And kids do benefit from access to a Catholic vision, to the extent that we can offer it in a less tainted way. We do right by them. And part of offering it in a less tainted way is being honest about the complexity of our hearts and complexity in our relationship with these teachings. So I respect parents who will say to their kids, this is a place of ongoing tension and challenge for me, without going into all of the details and over disclosing. Like, this is an area I wrestle with God in. Like the greats in scripture wrestle with God. And I want you to also be able to wrestle with God. And so I'm giving you these teachings so that you can wrestle with them in an honest way, because that develops the virtue of courage and fortitude and perseverance. We can't persevere in something we don't know. We also can't persevere very well in something that we're kind of having thrown in our face in a language that we can't even understand.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it also creates positively a sense of, I think of a passage from St. John Henry Newman that I'm absolutely going to butcher. This isn't even a paraphrase, but like the heart of what he was saying is, even though it may make mistakes and stumble, a conscience that's seeking what's good and true is going to find what's good and true. That, like, in God's time, in the messiness of life, that conscience will find, like, that person will find the voice of God. And if this is true, right, like equipping kids, adolescents, teens, young adults, you can wrestle with this, because if it's true, that will bear itself out.
That's right.
Just don't stop wrestling with it.
That's right. Yeah, God cares more about all of this than we possibly could. He is seeking us. He is revealing himself to us in real time, in the present time, as much as in any other period of history, and we can trust him. And we can't perfectly trust anything else.
No. This has been so good. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about that I didn't ask you about?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I think we could go on for hours about these things, and I hope we get to down the line. And for now, just kind of helping parents remember. I think a lot of times when parents listen to me, what I hear from them is, oh gosh, I couldn't say it that way, or I couldn't do it that way. And right at this point in listening, the shame and guilt can start to really just steep in. And so just to kind of notice whatever is there, I suppose, for people listening, as far as what are the voices that are incriminating you and telling you that you couldn't possibly, and just to kind of set that, maybe ask that voice to take a step back just for a second, and maybe sink into the recognition that by virtue of being right here in this moment, God is equipping and preparing us for the good work he has for you to do with your particular kids, which nobody else could do for you. If they could, you wouldn't be their parent. and so let that, again, be a place of anchor as you go out and kind of step by step begin to apply some of the things that we're hoping to offer here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Julie, where can people follow you and find your work?
Yeah, so the easiest way to keep in touch with me is, certainly I'm on social media. Instagram is kind of where I post the majority of what I'm up to. My website is juliasadusky.com, so quite easy. I'm sure we can put that in the show notes. And then for parents who are really looking for more formation around the topics we're talking about today, I just rolled out a video series for Catholic parents that really is meant to go along with the book for parents of teens and have me model and script some of the key concepts from that book. And so if you're interested, there's a course that I've rolled out, a video course that has attached a supplemental handbook with kind of worksheets, diagrams, key things that you're going to need for conversations with your teens. So if you are looking for more, there is more and more to come in all of this. And so I would, again, check out my Instagram and my website to find out how to get access to that resource.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll link to those things and your Substack as well. I found that.
That's right.
That very valuable too.
Yes, it's a newer thing that I'm doing, really enjoying kind of putting out little snippets. So yeah, people are free to kind of follow along there as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Paul.
And thank you for listening to the Third Space podcast. If you like this conversation, please subscribe. Episodes will be released every other week. And please share it with a friend and give it a rating on your favorite podcast app so that more people can discover the show. You can sign up for my newsletter or send me a message at catholicthirdspace.com. And while you're there, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. All of your support directly helps my family and allows me to continue working on projects like this podcast. If you want to schedule individual coaching with me or have me out to speak or consult with your community, parish, seminary, or diocese, please visit livingsolidarity.com. And you can join me at Smart Catholics, the online community for Catholics who want faithful conversations that go beyond easy answers or black and white fundamentalism. That's smartcatholics.com. Thanks for listening.